Welcome to 7 Prophecies of the Future, a future studies program series that will take you on a transdisciplinary journey of discovery into the unknown. Each episode brings together 2 guests who will act as oracles, revealing a secret password to enter a realm filled with poetic images and intriguing phenomena. All oracles are part of a wider divinatory speculative endeavor, the Future Studies program. They will share their destinations of the future on the occasion of the Venice Biennial Italian Virtual Pavilion 2021. And I, Andrea Cetrulo, will be guiding you through the corridors that lead us to these oracles of futurity. On this episode, we will enter the domain of power, governance, the will, and the sovereign. Password, reign. Reign is defined as a period when a particular person, feeling, or quality is very important or has a strong influence. Or alternatively, when a king or queen reigns, he or she rules a country. Now, today we're going to expand this concept by asking our oracles, who could that queen or king of the future be? And in what domain, secret or public, could she or he reign? As such, I welcome our 2 oracles of this episode, Nandita Biswas Mellamphy, Associate Professor of Political Theory at Western University, who has published several books on Nietzsche, political thought, power, warfare, and governance, and Arshin Adib-Moghaddam, Professor of Global Thought and Comparative Philosophies at the University of London, also author of several books on politics, specializing in West Asia and North Africa. Great. So Nandita and Arshin, welcome. I will start by relaying the questions from our oracles of the previous episode, Carla Leitao and Dan Mellamphy, relating to reign and futurity. So they both ask you, thinking about differences between reign and governance, is there ever a way to imagine a benevolent king, reigning, governing entity? And if we could design it, so to speak, what would it look like? Wow, that's a good question. Nandita, would you like to go first?
Sure. What a great set of questions, and in many ways, very hard, way too hard for me to, I think, answer in any satisfying way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tease out some very provisional response, I think. And let me begin by thanking you for this opportunity. I'm so happy to be here. So thinking about the ideas of reign and governance and the possible differences between them, I mean, I think I would say they have a lot in common. There is a lot of overlap conceptually, but in terms of the differences, I think a key difference might be that the word reign is typically associated with a regime or ruler, a head or heading under which everything is yoked. Whereas governance does not necessarily have to be captured in a head. It could be headless. It could be a mechanism or an assemblage of mechanisms. But again, these differences really don't hold up ultimately. A monarch can reign, but so can an abstraction. So I think I'll pay attention to the convergences between both words. I think both words have very similar etymologies. Reign comes from the Latin regnum, meaning kingship, dominion, rule, realm, which is related to regere, to rule, to direct, keep straight, guide, from the Proto-Indo-European root reg or rig, which means to move in a straight line, with derivatives meaning to direct in a straight line, and thus has this idea of to lead, to rule. Interestingly, it's related to the Sanskrit Raj, a king, a leader, and the Persian Rast, meaning right, correct. It's also related to the Greek oregein, to reach, extend, and the Old Irish rigim, to stretch out. Now, similarly, the word governance comes from the Old French governance or gouvernance, meaning government, rule, administration, or conduct. So I think this is a question having to do with rule, ruling, and rulership, including and extending to questions of authority, influence, dominion, like questions like who rules over whom and in whose name. I think it also involves more subtle questions of design, organization, scale, and relationalities, such as governance in relation to oneself or self-governance, governance of oneself in relation to others, and governance of collectivity. So I think there have been many attempts at imagining ideal rulers and designing optimal regimes of rule. The vast literatures and histories of political ideas in various cultures around the world attest to that. But what is a utopia for some always turns out to be a dystopia for others. We don't all have the same perspectives, nor do we occupy the same positions and locations. But I think we do have to think about the design of our institutions, our political arrangements and relations, and the salutary ways of conducting ourselves so that there is a planet for future generations of humans and non-humans. Whatever else politics is, it is, I think, very fundamentally about imagining and designing alternate ways of conducting and governing ourselves. So what I think I'll do is I'll stop there and see what Arshin has to say.
Just starting out by saying thank you to Andrea for fantastic introductions throughout the Future Studies program. Also, Jason Mohabeb, who was a great director, and Ed Keller for the opportunity at the Biennale in Venice to present all of this. But the question is intricate, and Nandita, did a fantastic job to kind of cut it down. So maybe I can focus on the second part, on what type of reign or governance would be benevolent or less oppressive maybe than some of the models that we have. So power comes to play, of course, when there is a regnum, when there is the sovereign exercising some type of politics on us. So power is important when it comes to reigning. And the more power is aggregated, the bigger it is, the more oppressive it is, because there are then hierarchies involved, right? And they're formalized. Doesn't matter if it's your boss or your professor or the prime minister or president. There are kind of rules and formalized ways of power that make it possible for them to exercise it. And then it involves hierarchy. So the bigger power is, the more oppressive it tends to be. So if we would look at it from another angle, we would then logically have to say that if we cut power down, into like almost little atoms, minuscule pieces, at that stage it becomes more manageable, less oppressive maybe even, and it also allows for more resistance. So that spatial aspect, I think, is important. On one spectrum, you have the kind of monopoly on power, aggregated, sturdy and quite authoritarian. On the other side, you have like little power, if you like. If we could get there, then it would probably translate into what Nandita said, into a society that is less oppressive and more libertarian, I think. Utopia.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for those responses. You'll be able to follow up in more detail as we continue with this conversation. So I would like to do that by asking Nandita, what do you have for us as a mythic example of reign?
So, just a little preamble, I'll say, to give you a sense of what I'm going to be doing. The past, this is the Future Studies program, but, in many and most ways, the past turns out to be a real treasure trove of sources and inspirations for the task of, I think, imagining or reimagining, designing and redesigning what a beneficially and equally beneficially to all a polity would be. So we're going to take you through 3 images. Actually, I have 4 images, and I think Arshin may have a few more as well. But this will allow me to riff on some of the topics that have interested me for some time now. I will take you through and refer to many various cosmologies, time periods, and literatures, but ultimately, everything does flow back to the concept of rain, and specifically to the question of how cosmos, which simply means orderly arrangement, is to be imagined and designed. And of course, there are so many different ways of approaching and entering into this weaving of words and worlds. So mine will be rather random and provisional and perhaps even improvisational, I admit. But one thing I did want to provide you with would be some kind of weird, peripheral, but provocative, and ultimately perhaps dark vision of these topics. So the images that I'm going to talk about in the following piece are kind of dark and will have a decidedly dystopian cast to them. So the first image we have here is less a myth per se, and more a mythic symbol that can be found in many different forms in various different cultural contexts. The mythic aspect, which I refer to in relation to the theme of rain, is therefore the concept of uroboros, as it was called in the ancient Greek. The uroboros is depicted as the reign of a serpent or dragon eating its own tail, continually devouring itself and being reborn from itself, hence the crown on the dragon's head. The uroboros epitomizes the ruling principle of unity of the material and spiritual planes, which revolve in a cosmic cycle of destruction and recreation. The uroboros is the very symbol of the loop, marking beginning and end, the feedback loop, so to speak, that governs all processes of transformation. The uroboros, as an emblem of cosmos or orderly arrangement, seeks to privilege the uroboric principle, which, as I will get to, is really about transmutation, both spiritual and material. So the word uroboros comes from the ancient Greek uro, or tail, and boros, meaning devourer. The oldest known image of the uroboros was found in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamen, which dates back to about the 13th century BCE. Generally, for the Egyptians, the symbol expresses the transformation of cyclical time and constant transformation. Like reoccurring seasons, or the annual flooding of the sacred Nile, or the journey of the rising and setting sun, the icon of the dragon eating its own tail symbolized the temporal repetition and renewal of cyclical time. Primarily associated with the idea of protective enclosure, the dragon eating its own tail has been conceived of as a divine force functioning at multiple scales: cosmic, planetary, and individual. In the ancient Indic traditions, the dragon eating its own tail is depicted as supporting both the foundation upon which the earth rests and encapsulating the heavens, drawing all beings, divine, human, and non-human, into the folds of becoming. In the Indic theory of temporal cycles from the ancient epic Mahabharata, all of creation is divisible into 4 great epochs or yugas. And like the ancient Greek theory of time, the Hindu cycle depicts time as a gradual process of decay that degenerates into a phase of destruction, which nonetheless initiates cosmic renewal, cosmic transformation, and rebirth. According to the Mahabharata, the world is today in the final phase of destruction and the tail end of its cycle. In the alchemical traditions of Europe, the uroboros expresses what's called the action of the dragon. That is to say, the active or transformative power of poison, of poisonous diffusion, symbolized by the cosmic and chaotic dragon eating its own tail and exhaling fire from its nostrils, creating the fiery circuit of the alchemical uroboros, the uroboric drakontos, the heraldic hieroglyph of transmutation itself, represented as the transformation of iron or lead into gold. Originally, the dragon is depicted as serpentine, since the blood of a serpent dragon was said to have acidic and corrosive qualities. In early European cartography, the dragon was used as a spatial symbol denoting dangerous or unexplored territories. Hic sunt dragones, here be dragons. In alchemy or protochemistry, dragon blood was the symbol for the active property in all red oxysulfuric metals. And so it is related to the alchemical phase known as eos, or the reddening, which holds the key, it is said, to the secrets of alchemical transformation. The Latin word virus or virus derives from the Sanskrit root visham, meaning poison, by way of the Greek word eos. According to Berthelot's collection of ancient Greek alchemists, published in 1888, the action of eos, or poison, describes viral transformation, or the active property and transformative power of poison, which, for example, occurs in the oxidation of metals or when the volatile principle of mercury is harnessed and transformed. So quoting Berthelot here, eos derives from the substance which has lost its corporeality through the action of the dragon. So the action of the dragon is to unbind and to propagate through the operation of unbinding. It activates dissolution and unbinds the forces of stasis by unleashing venomous agents that cannot be contained or neutralized, but out of which renewal and regeneration spring forth anew. Alchemically, the uroboros is considered a purifying glyph. The tail devourer is the symbolization of the endless circle of existence as transformation, as well as symbol both of the union of opposites, particularly the beginning and the end, as well as the union of all into one. So what can this image of the dragon eating its own tail tell us about governance, self-governance, governance of others, and governance of the whole? Does the uroboros ultimately promise the hope of a common cosmopolitan or unified world that could be the basis of a sustainable political and ethical design for governance of future generations? Like a kind of cosmic federation of living forms united by the uroboric principle of transformation? Or rather, does the uroboros portend the opposite? The revelation that there is no one design of unity, no single cosmos, but only multiple divergent worlds. I'm not going to answer that question because it'll probably take the whole histories of philosophy to do that, but I leave it open-ended.
Thank you, Nandita. And Arshin, how would you like to follow up this fantastic example?
So in this strange meeting of minds, actually, we have a shared passion, it seems, for creatures that appear sinister and devious. So I have my own little creature to share with you. So let me just do that. Okay. So going back to what Nandita wonderfully set out in the etymology of regnum, to reign, it always also has to do with size then, right? The monarch, the sovereign, rules and expansion and conquest becomes a part of that. And so we have the ghoul here, who is a giant, a mythical giant, but we will see that this mythical giant actually has an existence of its own in various cultures. We see him here on the left in the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, Persian tales of the 10th, 11th century. The Netflix series Ghoul produced in India, and then various other ghouls roaming around and floating around. So the first set of images speaks to this spatial aspect of our theme. And this is the ghoul in Arabic or ghoul in English, from which the term ghoulish is derived. So you have a whole genre of horror movies that can be associated with that. The ghoul is a humanoid giant who was born in the Arabic fables compiled in the legendary 1001 Arabian Nights, but whose gigantic presence expands to many other cultural territories in a truly trans-spatial format, much in the same way as our term reign implies. Like Goliath and empires, the ghoul too is all about size and expansion. Indeed, the word ghoul is also closely related to an Arabic adjective, which means to size up. In the first session of our series, Nora Khan quite brilliantly introduced the jinn as a mythical creature. The ghoul is related to the jinn, more bigger, more gigantic. So going back to the issue of space, but certainly related. He could also appear as a temptress, or at least an enchantress, as ghouls have been identified as female creatures who are sometimes called mother ghoul or ghula in Arabic, or relational terms such as aunt ghoul. She is portrayed in many tales luring hapless characters, who are usually men, there's no surprise here, into their home where the ghoul devours them. So we'll get to the vulnerabilities of the ghoul in the latter part. I don't want to only portray her or him or it in a kind of negative light. I think there is a lot of compassion one could have for the ghoul as well, but we will get to that. The ghoul as the ultimate other, so to say, of the mythical world, and hence also a harbinger of resistance and traumas that he or she or it needs to filter out. And perhaps it is these facets and the adaptability that explain why and how the spirit of the ghoul has departed from his original habitat in the Arabic Persian world and conquered various realms of society throughout the globe. So we can already see the Netflix series that I indicated, Ghoul, but indeed, the ghoul appears in many other parts of the world. So another set of images, if I may. So you find the ghoul in the Japanese manga and anime genre. Manga is Japanese for comics, and here in particular in the famous Tokyo Ghoul anime series. So here you have a female ghoul on the one side, a non-gendered ghoul, in Tokyo Ghoul, and it's really a famous anime series in Japan. The ghoul appears in various forms, even going back to, again, our spatial definition and the issue of expansion. You have here an expansion of questions of gender as well. It appears not only as that macho ghoul, if you like, but also as female and non-gendered. So again, space is not only a factor in oppression or hierarchy, it can also be emancipatory in this case. So you find the ghoul also in the US TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when Buffy battled with 4 female ghoul enchantresses, a really famous 1990s TV series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Some of you may remember. And one of the episodes was actually called Ghoul Trouble. In this case, you see in the center a rather menacing and evil-looking ghoul. In a more shocking example from a real tragedy, the so-called Plainfield Ghoul in 1950s Minnesota refers to Ed Gein, a mentally ill murderer and body snatcher who built furniture pieces out of the remains of corpses which he snatched from local graveyards. So this is unfortunately a real story. You see here Ed Gain on the left-hand side, and in the center, I think this is probably the dwelling where he created those sinister furniture pieces out of real human bones. And then, as you would expect, you also have a movie about him. And some of the household names of evil characters like Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of Lambs was also modeled on this chap. Ed Gain himself really was also, I mean, villain, of course, criminal, but in many ways also a victim of his childhood. His father was a horrible alcoholic, and he had serious mental health issues. And so again, I don't want to, further a depiction of the ghoul even in his real manifestation as, uniformly evil. And finally, the ghoul even appears in Harry Potter as a rather benevolent, almost cute creature, which lives in the attic of 12 Grimmauld Place, which was the ancestral home of the Black family, located in the borough of Islington in London. A ghoul task force exists at the Ministry of Magic under the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. So you have a rather cute looking ghoul here, but size still appears to be an issue. So, the gigantic size of the ghoul certainly is one of the main features. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised that the ghoul has such a vivid presence in global culture. As the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung said, we are living our myths and dreams, sometimes without even knowing it, and we live it as a common human experience. So this is how the ghoul could escape the tales of the Arabian 1001 Nights and travel as far as to J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The ghoul as myth, as reality, is an expression of the collective conscious. So this global travel itinerary expresses core ideas that are part of the human species as a whole. This common origin in the collective unconscious explains why a mythical creature, such as the ghoul, who was born in societies at the opposite end of the earth, can be strikingly similar to our own humanoid monsters. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to see how the different oracles and mythical creatures are conversing with each other throughout the episodes. So now let's transit into the second image thought. I'll ask you, Nandita, to share an artistic image that you think has generated some form of representation or manifestation of the concept of rain.
Sure. It is very striking how ghoulish our minds are, Arshin. Similarly, and I'm really glad you led with that, because it makes now my images, I think, the ghoulishness of these images very resounding. So thank you for that. So the second set of images I'd like to present are of Chinnamasta, and very ghoulish indeed. The first on the left-hand side is called German Renaissance Chinnamasta, and it was done in 2018 by the artist Ravi Zupa. And the other is a mid-18th century Kangra painting of Chinnamasta from India. And I wanted to show both because I think you can see that what Zupa has done is take the themes and actual iconography of the 18th century paintings of Chinnamasta and kind of redone them, repurposed them in a very interesting way. So I have these images sort of side by side to both juxtapose them, but also to show their similarities. So who is Chinnamasta? Well, Chinnamasta is a Hindu goddess of transformation. Again, that theme of transformation comes back. She is one of the wisdom goddesses, or Mahavidyas, one of the 10 incarnations of the goddess. She is depicted holding her own severed head, which she has just cut off. She's known as the self-decapitated goddess and is recognized as a divine incarnation of primordial cosmic energy, or Shakti. So stories of her origin vary, but there's one that relates that the goddess Parvati was bathing with 2 attendants who asked the goddess to satisfy their hunger. And after putting them off several times, Parvati looked around and then cut her own head off. 3 streams of blood came from her neck, and at this point, Parvati is transformed into the goddess Chinnamasta, whose name literally means severed head. In other versions, you see what I have a very libidinal mind. In other versions, not virgins, Chinnamasta is standing on a couple. So literally on top of a couple who are in the midst of coitus, of having sex. And the couple is said to be Rati, the goddess of sexual desire, and her husband, Kama, the god of love. So Chinnamasta is depicted as a young woman adorned with the garland of skulls and necklace of bones. Like Kali, the goddess Kali, she wears on her naked body a serpent as the sacred thread. And in the second image you see here, she is covered by lotus flowers and strings of beads. But her most gruesome aspect is that she has cut her head off with a sword, both of which she holds in her hands. The blood gushing out of her decapitated head sprouts and spouts in 3 jets. The scene is set on the site of a crematorium where death reigns supreme. So it's rather macabre. What then can this image of this goddess who has severed her own head tell us about governance, self-governance, governance of others, global governance, and planetary governance? Well, I think these depictions of Chinnamasta evoke varying and conflicting aspects of life and death, of self-destruction while nourishing others, of violent death, as well as the joys of sexuality and sex. The juxtaposition of destruction and creation, of joy and suffering. This image of Chinnamasta, or these images of Chinnamasta, combine elements of heroism, terror, and eroticism, and portray a composite picture of death as intrinsic to the multiplicity of life. Chinnamasta, in her energetic form, shows the power of transformation in action, it is said. And in this sense, this headless deity is a symbol of transformation and transmutation of ontological and material states and scales. Chinnamasta also epitomizes liminality, both pre-human and post-human, I would say, the libidinal and overabundant energetic conditions of life and death. She is multiple and terrifyingly inhuman. She's almost obscene, subverting civility, furious, presaging doom and destruction, as well as erotic pleasure and sexual release. Like Georges Bataille's image of transgression, Chinnamasta's transgression conjoins the void of death and the plenitude of eroticism, in which the profane and homogeneous economy of restricted use value gives way to the sacred heterogeneity of an excess that no system can control and that must be squandered, lost without profit, spent gloriously and catastrophically. While bloodthirsty and destructive, she is also considered the chaotic guardian of the cosmos. Her destructive and uncontrollable powers being the necessary precondition for renewal and regeneration. Her presence portends the emergence of war as the presiding paradigm, and terror as the primordial affect that powers its circuits. Not war and terror as instruments of human power, but humans as fuel and fodder for the transmutation of the overhuman. In Chinnamasta's fury, fatality and fertility collude, conspiring to commit ontological sabotage. Against and in contrast with, let's say, a Hegelian schema of reason, recuperation, and recognition, Chinnamasta is a transgression of sociality, utility, and intentionality. Rather, she is inhuman, eruptive, and virulent, what Nietzsche might call a Dionysian rather than an Apollonian mode of becoming. Barbaric, she opens onto the realm of the forbidden, beyond the conventional and socially sanctioned, thereby liberating it from the inherited, imposed, and inhibiting categories of proper and improper, good and evil, polluted and pure. Chinnamasta embodies becoming untamable, unassimilable, unanthropomorphizable. So these images of Chinnamasta conjure and evoke an important but often undiagnosed aspect of our networked future, I think. That the networked condition we are currently in is manifesting itself in more and more furious ways. It is itself becoming more pack or animal-like, that is prehistoric, inhuman, heterogeneous, and multiple. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nandita. Of course, you mentioned Nietzsche, but somehow it also reminded me of Max Stirner's idea of egoism. Yeah, very interesting. Now, Arshin, what is your artistic image of choice to illustrate the rain?
So, stepping back a little bit from the beautifully ghoulish depictions that Nandita shared, and slightly less horror-like. This is a painting, and I will get to its origin in a second. But Nandita also, again, quite clearly set out that the rain or regnum has to do with space, right? This is how we started, and then I try to add to that the sovereign always also has a kind of imperial outward-looking mentality, like a conquistador mentality, really. He or she is a geopolitician, right? It's all about kind of Lebensraum, as the German theoretician Leopold von Ranke put it. The realm of the sovereign always demands territory. It can be physical, mental, and these days increasingly virtual. Of course, I will get to that towards the end. But space is important when it comes to reigning, and expansion is a part of that. But for the sovereign, it's always also important to have speed, right? Power, as we established also at the beginning, always also has to do with speed. So that brings us then to this wonderful painting, which is also on my most recent book, What is Iran? But that's not so important. The important bit is the painting, and that was made by Lida Sharafatman, the Maltese Iranian painter, incredibly talented. She paints with flowers, so you can see, like, intricate flowers, bigger flowers, and they kind of frame and enunciate everything that she does. The method itself is called fluorescentism, which is really the new ism, I believe, in contemporary art. Amazing talent there. But in this particular painting, we can see that the phoenix, so in the centerpiece, you see that's a phoenix, or Seymour, in the kind of Persian lexicon, the phoenix is really flying with such a supersonic velocity that it almost disintegrates, exuding, in this case, the elements of an imagined national identity. You see, a romantic part here, which speaks to Persian poetry. You see the dervishes whirling around, which is also part of the kind of Persian, Turco-Arabic culture. You see revolutionaries, you see the avant-garde that brought about the revolution in 1979, Khomeini, the ghoul of the revolution, you know, at the same time, a Lenin and a Robespierre wrapped in one, and many other aspects of that imagined, mythical in many ways, national identity. But speed is important, and the phoenix is meant to represent that kind of speed. So speed has always been the great guerrilla tactic of the hunter and the warrior, as hunting and pursuit are at the heart of revolutions, wars, and combat. Empires were at the top of this hierarchy of speeds. For to reign, to possess territory, to expand, also means to have the best means to scan the world in order to colonize it. So here we have then the transition to the virtual world of today. If in the past we were governed by an incredibly alienating, ghoulish colossus, or the machine, as the Iranian intellectual Jalal al-Ahmad famously named it, then today's data-driven technopolitics are foreshadowing an equally intrusive form of supersonic governmentality that is immediate, borderless, and in its hyperspeed, almost invisible. So again, the speed factor comes in. We had the ghoul in terms of the spatial aspect, and now, space as another factor for reining us in, I guess. There are many examples for these weapons of mass control to rein us in. For instance, the global biometric data that is collated as a part of our health apps, or our social media footprint, which merge into algorithms that decide upon our mortgage application, employability, parole, or even into programs that determine how attractive we are. So kind of move from the past to the present, and then we're at the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arshin. Now, lastly, I will ask Nandita to share with us an emergent phenomenon, or her emergent phenomenon of choice, linking rain to futurity, and to tell us why it is worth our attention.
Well, I promise Arshin and I did not plan this ahead of time, but it's just really amazing how in sync our flow is today. So I'm really pleased that worked out so well. So I would be very happy to then show my last image. Of course, indeed, to the present, and to a very recent present, I think, a global present. So I think what Arshin just presented in terms of speed and the phoenix and that beautiful, almost beatific image that nonetheless still has ghoulish implications, I think. It very nicely dovetails into this image, my last image that I wanted to show, which many of you may indeed recognize because it happened very recently. This is the 1,800 flying drones that formed a globe at the recent opening ceremonies of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And so for me, this image in many ways represents the kind of data-driven pursuit that the entire globe is currently undertaking. So to the world, you know, this impressive technical feat symbolized the perfect fusion of human ingenuity and non-human technicity, representing probably the potentials of future human, non-human collaboration. Yet, of course, it might be interpreted in other ways and darker ways. So let me take a shot at it. The drone is more than just a current technology. It symbolizes a future tendency and even an emerging horizon in which more and more decision-making will be technically driven by machine-to-machine communications and human-computer interfaces. According to the philosopher Benjamin Noyes, drones inhabit a metaphysical field, embodying dreams of transcendence and destruction that have haunted the Western imagination. And I quote Noyes here: "The drone finds its destination as the signature device of contemporary forms of power, our mobile, all-seeing eye," end quote. Philosopher Paul Virilio also described the aim of such military, what he called military sight machines, by suggesting, and I quote, "In a technician's version of an all-seeing divinity, the drive is on for a general system of illumination that will allow everything to be seen and known at every moment and in every place," end quote. So juxtaposed with the ethereal and godlike flying drones aestheticized by the Tokyo Olympics opening ceremonies, in which 1,800 flying drones combined to form an aerial globe, the Predators and Reaper drones of drone warfare also incarnate this global and godly vision. Explicitly reflecting on drones, Virilio later comments, quote, "The eye of God is everywhere," end quote. The theological resonance here is even noted by drone operators themselves, with one reported as having said, quote, "Sometimes I feel like a god hurling thunderbolts from afar," end quote. So it is no coincidence that the information surveillance powers now available to police, governments, and third-party security corporations are being compared to quasi-futuristic sci-fi scenarios like that of Philip K. Dick's 1956 short story, Minority Report, which was turned into a very successful film by Spielberg in 2002, and features a plot in which advanced technologies enable police to predict, identify, and incarcerate people before they actually commit a crime. The cop at the heart of what is called the pre-crime unit, John Anderton, is of course totally on board with this, with the goals of the pre-crime unit, until of course he himself becomes a victim of its predictive technologies and becomes identified as a pre-criminal, eventually going on the run to evade the authorities that are in hot pursuit. The Department of Pre-Crime criminalizes people before they have even committed a crime, a truly ethical dilemma based on current legal frameworks of individual rights and responsibilities, by bringing home the norms of wartime into the civilian spaces of peacetime. In this way, civilian spaces begin to operate as if they were military battlefields. The normalization of information surveillance technologies has the effect of militarizing civilian spaces, as the logic of war invades the physical and psychic spaces of civil society on a global scale. The current pandemic, global pandemic, and the rise of extreme weather caused by climate change has many key international institutions talking about the need for transnational, global, and planetary level cooperation. Many favor the idea of global citizen and theories of cosmopolitan citizenship. Notwithstanding the various conceptions of cosmopolitanism in contemporary political, social, and moral philosophies, the standard vision claims that all human beings, regardless of their differences, can and should be regarded as citizens of a single human community or confederation. Standard cosmopolitanisms thus tend to depend on the primacy of the liberal Enlightenment conception of the human individual endowed with basic human rights, and is as such grounded in humanism. At the outset of the 21st century, however, widespread engagement with the advanced digital technologies of the information age have extended the reign of technologies over human boundaries beyond just the global to increasingly planetary and post-planetary, as Ed Keller says, even transhuman scales. As the recent anthology Critical Posthumanism and Planetary Futures asks, what kinds of futures await contemporary societies in the age of the limit condition of the human? Transhumanist cosmopolitanists might seek to extend the concept of cosmopolitan citizenship beyond the limits to include non-human, that is animal, vegetal, mineral, and machinic life forms, which would entail the affirmation of hybrid human, non-human interfaces and identities. However, efforts to actualize transhuman cosmopolitanist agendas have demanded the widespread adoption of an impoverishing and instrumentalizing fantasy of technological enlightenment. Posthuman post-colonists would thus criticize the Prometheanism of transhuman cosmopolitanist narratives, instead emphasizing their complicity with the inequities and inequalities produced by a hyper-consumptive, hyper-technical form of capitalism. Drones are the invention of a new kind of war machine that sustains itself in and upon so-called peace, or more precisely upon the militarization of peace. These viral agents, these weapons are larval operatives. Under cover of peaceful and peacetime activity, they open themselves up to the virulent fog of larval warfare that everywhere propagates the force of unbinding. Politics, economics, culture, society, all of the curatives of human ingenuity have lost their power to bind. Rather, power's main effect today is to obfuscate, corrode, contaminate, unbind, and thus potentially alter, modulate, recombine, and perhaps even transmute. The virulence of this larval warfare unleashes the immunopolitical responses that attack the state's own body politic within the logistics of peacetime by fomenting paranoia, pitting citizen against citizen, and unbinding the state's civil institutions and institutionalized values, rendering them fragile, porous, and open to further insurrection. Within the alchemical logic of larval warfare, no visible or transgressive act of war or of terrorism is required for the body politic to begin cannibalizing itself, especially when greased by the lube of petrochemical narratives. The biopolitics of the state becomes subject to the autophagic process of decay unleashed by virulence. In contemporary terms, this might be a good way to understand the rise of the new right and the alt-right, with their focus on metapolitical strategies that seek to transform the broader landscape of culture outside of established political channels. Even in cases where these movements have taken hold the levers of government, the aim of political strategy is to unbind the body politic. In this scenario, the system is rigged. All ideologies and beliefs can be used as bait for the active propagation of unbinding across various environments. The aim of this kind of move is to unleash the virality of war, to capture the system in order to exploit its weaknesses, to use the system against itself in order to unbind it and return it to a state of nature, which, as Hobbes reminds us, is bellum omnium contra omnes, a total war of all against all. Today, the aim of warfare is not just territorialization, that is, to gain political hegemony over physical territory, but increasingly, perhaps, to unleash and exploit deterritorializations and systemic insurgencies. The logic of contemporary network culture is clearly viral and can be understood as a mode of action that follows the specific logic of contagion and repetition. Memes, a dominant viral form in contemporary network cultures, may be contagious consumer objects, as UC Parika warns, but they should also be thought of as poisonous actants with subversive agendas and voracious appetites for the galvanizing effects of decomposition. This is the pestilent power of the California ideology, the reigning creed of Silicon Valley that grows and flourishes in the age of virality, which is also the age of democratic ruin. It is the age of the exploitation of the weaknesses of the democratic body politic by way of democratic rhetoric. It is the age that makes way, as Plato has already noted in books 8 and 9 of the Republic, for the tyrant, for tyranny, for fascism, which becomes the logical outcome of democratic failure. For Walter Benjamin, fascism obscures and distracts energies that would otherwise be used by the demos, the many poor, to revolt against the capitalist system. Instead, fascist virulence both aestheticizes and anesthetizes the demos. Quote, this is quoting Benjamin here, "The masses have a right to changed property relations. Fascism seeks to give them expression while keeping these relations unchanged. The logical outcome of fascism is the aestheticization of political life." End quote. Thus, behind every fascism, there lies a failed revolution. The very parasitical logic of the virus is to unbind the polis, but not by killing it immediately, indiscriminately, and once and for all, not by wiping it out, rather and instead by slowly exploiting its weaknesses, harnessing and transmuting its powers, by operating with and in the praise economy of survival, sustaining itself once again by keeping host organisms in an ongoing state of decay. So we see that today, at present, right now, riding high on the tide of Silicon ideology, in this time period ruled by human supremacists, in which technicity has rapidly outpaced the human itself, the concept of the Anthropocene is but a harbinger of what could be called the Electrocene, as I've argued elsewhere, the era of electro-technical connections and transmutations that unleash and electro-technically unbind the polis and its demos, and arguably the human itself. So here there be dragons, for sure, in all their cyber fury. Here there are the Furies who have come back with a vengeance, I would argue. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nandita. Well, to take further the compenetration and synchronicity that both our oracles are having today, what can you tell us, Arshin, about an emerging phenomenon in the realm of the rain?
Thank you. It is quite incredible, Nandita. I think you are my soulmate. Finally, I found you. Undoubtedly, there is a lot of congruence, and it's fascinating. No one could have written it better than this. But that's we could have gone on tour, I think, but that's probably for later. Anyhow, this is my last set of images, and you may have gathered. I tried to rescue the ghoul from the outset, and probably even all evil creatures and human beings from a one-dimensional depiction as kind of thoroughly evil. And I would try to continue, and even, in response to the wonderfully detailed analysis of Nandita, to look at the other side of the spectrum. We started out with it when we talked about like forms of governance. It could be benevolent and rain, and but what can we do, like to resist? Is there the option to do something about this terribly oppressive world that Nandita so rightly set out? So starting with our ghoul again, and his or her DNA. So first of all, he's or she is a humanoid who could easily transmute, obviously, in that techno society of ours, into a cyborg. Right? This is just one step away. We already have people like Kevin Warwick who have neural interfaces, who can control things, you know, from their arm and remote areas of the world. So, you know, this hybridization that Nandita talked about is already happening. So we already have cyborgs, and you know, they're in one way or another very much related to our ghoul. So as a cyborg, the ghoul continues to be like the chimeras of the past, modulated creatures with some human characteristics that merge with biomimetic technology. As such, the ghoul as cyborg, as other, creates an interregnum. So a space between the two regnums, right? Creates an interregnum from the present to the future. So I was interested in that space between, right? What happens between the regnum, and, you know, how can we extend that space? I love that space. I would like to dwell in it as far and as often as possible. So here the ghoul collates the traumas of marginalization, which led him to become the ultimate fallen creature. He cleanses himself by delving into the opportunities that our techno-society affords him. Unlike the tragic and sad creature in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the future cyborg ghoul finds fellow wayfarers, a whole host of bandits and outsiders who show hostility to restrictive social values and to arbitrary rule. This interregnum forms the basis for social alliances that are both trans-spatial and transhuman, as the cyborg ghoul becomes the déclassé of the future. So the ghoul as opportunity, if you like, and not as the ultimate enemy. So I will end with a set of questions building on that, you know, alliance with the cyborg ghoul, if you like, and with the romantic cyborg ghoul on the left-hand side. So is the continued fascination with mythical monsters not also the celebration of deviance as a way of life? Doesn't it inform the identification with Bohemia, with tribal cultures, the search for the exotic and the irrational, for mystical, hallucinatory, and other modes of seeking to transcend the quotidian, the mundane, the everyday, and the routine? Part of what we're doing at the Future Studies program as well, maybe a manifestation of that urge, if you like. And does it not inform identification with all kinds of alternative, underground, deviant, and minority social groups, and deviant subcultures, deviant, of course, in quotation marks? One thing is for sure: for every giant system that attempts to rein us in, there will be an equally powerful ghoul that questions that authority to rule over our lives. As such, the ghoul could be enemy or friend. This choice is still ours. So on that positive note, I would like to end it.
Excellent, Arshin. Now, to finalize, but also give continuity to this conversation, as we do in every episode, I invite you both to summon the oracles for the following episode and ask them a question related to their conceptual passcode, which in this case is somehow self-referential and is oracle. They will be answering on the next episode of 7 Prophecies of the Future. So please go ahead and ask them the question.
Okay, I'm summoning and okay, augury. Here is my question. Probably, I think for Anna Longo. What is the value of oracles in an age of quantum AI?
Excellent. Okay.
Arshin, do you have any specific question you would like to ask, or is that one good enough?
I would like to summon Dejan Lukic, and my question for him is also very succinct. Who are the ghouls of our present existence, and what do they do with our bodies and minds?
Well, thank you very much, both. There's definitely a lot to go through. I'm sure myself and our viewers will be rewatching it. There's a lot to unpack. So yes, thank you very much, both.
Thank you so very much, Andrea. And thank you, Arshin. And thank you to the Biennale and the Future Studies program as well. It was a delight.